Hello, it's Rebecca. I eat books. It's time for a wrap up. It is the beginning of December, so I have my November reads to wrap up, but I never wrapped up my October reads, so we're gonna do a twofer today and talk about everything I read in October, everything I read in November. We're gonna get into it because we got much to talk about. Let's see. I read 6 books in October, which is the worst reading month I've had this year. Or not worst, quantitatively smallest. November, I read 9 books, thanks mostly to the Tiny Book Challenge, which I did a vlog about. But today is the 3rd day of December, and I've already read 2 books, so we're cruising. I think I'm at 94 right now, which means if I read 6 more this month, I'll break 100 this year, which is stupid. The numbers are arbitrary, the numbers don't matter. But also, I've never read 100 books in a year before. I usually am closer to like 75. Would feel kind of cool. A totally arbitrary, useless goal that might be fun. So maybe I'll try for that. Woo. Okay, October and November. The first book that I read in October was 3 Rooms by Hamya. This was kindly sent to me by HMH. I enjoyed this book. This is definitely a young, thinky woman trying to make it in the world book. Very much a critique of how difficult it is to make a living wage and have a place to live. When I finished this and somebody sent me a DM and said, what did you think about it? My initial reaction to this book was that it was trying a little hard to do too many things. It was a workplace novel, campus novel, too many things. I enjoyed it. I thought the voice was good. It takes place in England. The first home is a room she rents as she's in grad school. The second is a couch she stays on in London. The third, I think, is up to the reader's interpretation. She's moving back home to her parents' house. I think that's a home. She's on a train in the 3rd section. I think you read it and you tell me what you think the 3rd home is, okay? Or sorry, 3rd room. Okay, my second book in October was one of my favorite books I read the entire year. Journal of a Solitude by Sarton. I love this book so much. Sarton was a poet. 50s, 60s, 70s. She wrote a fair amount of poetry that I think was very well received. She wrote some novels, which I think were less successful. And then later in life, she wrote and published a large collection of journals. This one, A Journal of a Solitude, is the most popular, generally considered the most well-regarded by critics, but I've already bought a little bit more Sarton, so there will be more Sarton in my future. This book takes place over the course of a year. She lives in a cabin in Nelson, New Hampshire, alone with her parrot. It's cold and she's lonely. She loves gardening and the manual labor of it. Some days she's telling you why solitude is the greatest gift, and other days she's telling you why it's a curse. It's so beautiful. It made me want to slow down everything I did, put my hand in my garden in the dirt. I've recommended this to many people already. I've also talked about this on here many times, but books written by poets are my favorite thing, and because the language is so purposeful and beautiful. This is another example of that. I love this so much. This was a gift from my friend Lindsay, who I believe I have now mentioned in every video ever recorded here. Next book I read, I have already returned to the library, but it was Feather on the Breath of God by Sigrid Nunez. I'll put a picture here. I have talked about Sigrid Nunez here before. She wrote The Friend, which is one of my favorite books I read this year. I loved it so much. She also wrote What Are You Going Through, which I really enjoyed. This, I believe, is earlier than both of those. It is a novel that reads very autobiographical, deals with themes of identity, race, and immigration. Both Sigrid Nunez and our protagonist are the child of a German mother and a Chinese Panamanian father. So there's a lot of discussion of cultural differences and what you inherit from your parents. Also, our protagonist, and I have to assume this is true of Sigrid Nunez because it was written so convincingly, is a ballet dancer, ballerina. descriptive writing of dance, ballet, the language of dance and the language of cultures and the way that these things are thematically intertwined. Enjoyable book. The fourth book I read in October was New People by Danzy Senna. This was the book chosen by my book club in October. I originally bought this book after reading a list of books recommended by Elena Savage, the author of Blueberries. This was on the list, so was The Friend. I ordered a bunch of cheap used copies, and when this showed up on my doorstep and I opened it, the blurbs were People magazine, Oh, the Oprah magazine, and Entertainment Weekly, and I thought, I'm not sure about this one, so I put it away for a long time because I'm a jerk and a snob. But my book club chose this, so we read it, and it was a good book club read. Lots to discuss here. This is a book about a woman who has just graduated college, is working on a dissertation, is living in Brooklyn with her fiance. Both she and her fiance are mixed race, and the New People refers to this idea of this new mixed race, multicultural subset of people who are living and moving into Brooklyn. A lot of themes of obviously race and specifically colorism, identity, and passing. The narrator of this story is one of the truly least likable narrators of any book I've ever read. Girl is cray, unreliable, cannot show up for anything on time, always has an excuse, loses everything. You know, I think the assumption being that being a woman of color in America, where people are saying like, you represent a whole new type of person. We're gonna make a documentary about you and who you are. You stand for your people. I think that would be crazy making for anybody. But yeah, she's psycho. She shakes a baby at one point. Sorry, ruined it. I didn't ruin it. That's not a spoiler. Spoiler is if I would tell you what happens at the end, which I'm not going to, but the end of this book was wild. Again, a really good, rich book for book club discussion. As soon as I finished it, I was texting my friends like, did anybody get to the end of this last page? We need to discuss. So this was fun. The next book I read in October was The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture by Wendell Berry. And I will say about this, don't meet your heroes, you know? I have a complicated relationship with Wendell Berry. There were definitely times in my life where I was obsessed with Wendell Berry. I think in college I thought that being into Wendell Berry was a personality, you know? One of those girls. I do love his poetry. I have some framed Wendell Berry poetry in the house. Love that he is an off-the-grid, back-to-the-earth Luddite. But this book did not age well for me. I put a quote on Instagram when I read it where he's just so... He says, anyone who's met children today knows what a disaster they are. You who are acquainted with the young can doubt that the modern home has also failed as a place of instruction. Cool. Children are not the problem, Mr. Berry. He's just such a grumpy, mansplainy man in this book. There is no way that anybody else's opinion could possibly have any merit in his eyes. That's how this reads. Yeah. Cool, bro. Hot take. I would say generally skip this, stick to Wendell's poetry, and be ignorantly blissful about your heroes. The last book that I read in October was The Weak Spot by Lucie, Elvin. This was kindly sent to me by Softskull, right? Yes. I loved it. Very weird book. We have our main character in an unnamed European town. In my mind, it was the French Alps. She gets this coveted job working as an apprentice to a pharmacist. The pharmacist has all of the power in this town because he speaks to every person and knows all their problems and issues and has access to their medical information. You'll be surprised to hear that men with power abuse it. This is a book about abusing your power and power dynamics. And it's just bizarre, and I liked it for that reason. The sentences are just weird. The way the words are put next to each other, unusual. I recommend this one. I'm curious to hear what more people think about it. So this was published February 2021. I feel like I haven't seen a lot of people talking about this. I'm curious to hear others' thoughts. So that was October. November. First book that I read in November, I don't have here because I lent it to a friend. It's called We Were Witches. It's also a weirdo, published by Feminist Press. Our main character has a child very young and then has a desire to build a career as a writer. This main character is queer and feminist and a little bit of a bruja. She is studying at Mills College, which I loved. That's in Oakland, and I've mentioned this many times here before. I can't get enough of a book that takes place in a city where I have lived. I love books from Oakland or DC or New Haven. They warm my heart. So in this, there's lots of themes around gender and this question about, can you, when you're being taught the canon, how do we rewrite the rule book when it doesn't apply to you? It's as if the narrator is saying, my existence, as a queer young single mother, is unfathomable to the people who I am studying, that their words couldn't possibly apply to me because they can't even imagine my existence. Is this book perfect? No. Is it heavy-handed at times? Yes. But it's an interesting take on the genre. I'm not sure it was groundbreaking, but it was definitely enjoyable. I clearly recommended it because I lent it to a friend. We'll see what she thinks. The next book I read was Austerlitz by W G Sebald. Boy, what to say about this book? This is a weirdo. This was recommended to me by a different Lindsay. Not the Lindsay I talk about in every video, but Lindsay Teague. Hi, Lindsay. I'm so glad that she recommended this to me. I probably would not have picked it up otherwise because this is a book that was on the shelf because my husband owned it. I just assume that any book he brought into the relationship is bad. But this wasn't. This was great. This book is a little dense. There are sentences that are a dozen pages long in this book. I'm looking right now, open to a random page. No block in the text. There's no paragraphs. So this right here is at least a 2-page long paragraph, and it continues and it continues. Yeah. It's very modern, almost stream of consciousness. It's about memory and trauma. Our main character, difficult to say if that's true. Our narrator is not our main character. Our narrator is a guy who is nothing. He is so periphery to the story. Our narrator is a guy who runs into another guy in a train station, and this other guy is an architect, an architectural historian. They get to talking and they run into each other again a decade later, reconnect. That in itself is sort of fanciful. This man who he has reconnected with is Austerlitz. Austerlitz tells our narrator his entire life story. Austerlitz was born Austerlitz but then raised by a different name. He didn't know that he fled Hitler and had his name changed and was adopted by another family. He lost his parents in the Holocaust. He tries to take back his name. He finds the woman who was his nanny when he lived with his biological parents to get understanding of who he was and what happened to him. Memories sort of flow into him that he had suppressed. So he's trying to retake back his memories, understand who he is, how who we were becomes who we are, and also a lot about storytelling. He is learning his own story from other people, from his nanny, from people of whom he can collect bits and pieces of his story. Then he's retelling all of those stories to our narrator, who's retelling it to us. We're learning about how identity is transferred through all of these people, convoluted through all the retellings and rememberings. Other thing I really like about this book, it is multimedia. So we have images throughout this book, which makes for a really interesting and enjoyable reading experience. I highly, highly recommend this. I would love to have studied this in school. I think this book was, as I mentioned, very dense, and I just think there's a lot of themes and metaphor here that I didn't necessarily pick up on that I would love to learn more about. The next book that I read was Desperate Characters by Paula. I mentioned this in my last video about gift giving because this is the book that I am giving to my friend Lindsay, the first Lindsay I mentioned in this video, because this is sort of an obscure little guy that I don't think she will have known about before. When it was published, was highly acclaimed, and then it fell out of print, was rediscovered by Jonathan Franzen. He made it his mission to get this back into print. Very much a writer's read. Some say it's the perfect post-war novel, and some people say that as a compliment. I think some people are saying that as if to say it's a little too precious. But this book is about a woman who is having an existential crisis. What's great about this book is it's very contained. It takes place over the course of one weekend. We have only a handful of characters, very tight. At the beginning of the weekend, she is having dinner at home with her husband. They live in Brooklyn, a very fancy brownstone. He is a lawyer. They are childless. She sees a cat outside. She goes to feed it and it bites her. And she spends the entire rest of the book freaking out about whether or not she has gotten rabies from this cat. Her life is sort of crumbling around her. Their neighborhood in Brooklyn is full of drugs, crime, poverty. And I listened to a podcast discussion about this, and they said, this is a book about gentrification. And I thought, this book takes place in the 60s. I'm pretty sure that's the opposite of what this is about. I think this is about white flight, actually. If you're a historian, if you're a Brooklyn historian, please come talk to me about the historical context. This idea of like seeing your surroundings feel very menacing and like they're falling apart is very much a part of the story. It is a reflection of that feeling within her. The world is full of monsters. I am rabid. This book is very closely following our main character, this woman, her experience, her conversations. It's very much in her head, her anxieties, her paranoia, which I love. I'm really glad that I sort of stumbled on this book. If anybody else has read this, please let me know. All right, the next 4 books that I read were for the Tiny Book Challenge, and I did a vlog about them, so I won't go too much in detail. If you want to hear me talk about these, you can watch the vlog where I read these 4 books. The first one I read was Signs Preceding the End of the World. This was by far my favorite. I really loved it. This is about immigration as a metaphor for death and finding your resting place, and to leave your homeland is for part of you to die. It's an allegory. It's phenomenal. It does really weird things with language, which I loved. I'm excited to read more Yuri Herrera. And then I really enjoyed both of these. Offshore, a romp. Mona, not a romp. Fun and enjoyable. Very traumatic to read. And this was my least favorite Tiny. I did not jive with this. This was a capital L love story, and it wasn't for me. If you want to hear me talk more about that, go to the vlog. All right, 2 more. Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux. This was my first Annie Ernaux. She is a French writer. I will read much more of her. I love this. This is a tiny book, 65 pages. On the surface, it is about an affair with a married man, but it's not. It never is. I think that this is a book about a love affair and relationship. This is a book that on the surface is about a relationship, but is not at all about that. It is about using that as a lens through which you see the world. Metaphor. This book is about rewriting one's story, ownership over your narrative, reclaiming your sense of identity and self and possession over your memory. And this is just about love. And that is the difference between these 2 books for me. I'm gonna get so much hate in the comments about that. If you love Owen Water, we can still be friends, I swear to God. I really like you, I do. Please don't be mean to me. This book is also very sexy. To the point where when I was reading it, don't be a little Puritan prude, Rebecca. Pull it together. Be cool, man. Be chill. I think that, part of me thinks like, is this a sexy book? Is she trying to be particularly sexy? Or is this a French cultural thing? Is this I am an American prude who grew up with puritanical roots, and this is just how the liberated French talk? I don't know, but I think it's such a tiny, thin book so that you can do this while you read. Last one. I read The Four Humors by Mina Seckin, kindly sent to me by Catapult. This is a new release. Our main character lives in the state, has a boyfriend from the state, is the child of Turkish immigrants, and her father has just died when the story begins. She is spending the summer visiting her grandmother in Turkey with her American boyfriend. This book has two major themes that feel divergent and I think are very well intertwined. First, this book is about family histories, family stories, lineage, how we learn about ourselves by understanding what our grandparents went through, who are our relatives, what is our lineage, who are our ancestors. Very much about that quest to understand your ancestors. This book is also about hypochondria, feeling like you're internally losing it a little bit. In that way, this is very much what CJ would call a DWM book, a depressed woman moving. Our main character is a depressed woman. She's dealing with grief of her father's death. She's very much processing that grief. It's forcing her to have a crisis, and her response is to look to this concept of the four humors, which is pre-modern science version of medicine. The humors are choler, bile, blood, and something else. This idea that if you are sick, it's because you have a buildup of one of these things and you need to be bled. This is back when they used to use bloodletting and leeches. Clearly she is grasping at something to create meaning, to put a box around the chaos in her life and in her internal situation. It's almost like, don't come at me for this, it's almost like astrology or horoscopes or personality tests, Enneagram, stuff like that, which don't get me wrong, I love all that shit too, we all do, but it's fun because it puts structure in place where it feels like there isn't any. And we have this woman who is going through a quarter life crisis, dealing with grief, all that. She needs to project meaning where she doesn't have any. This book was enjoyable. This book was not a perfect read for me. I thought it was too long. Needed to be edited down. There was a lot about her boyfriend drama. I didn't care for any of that. Not for me. I felt like that could have all been edited out. We could have been 75 pages shorter and been golden with this book. I really enjoyed being in Turkey while reading this. Not physically, I was here in New Haven, but mentally I was in Turkey, and that was wonderful. It was a great vacation. All right, we did it. That was October and November. Thank you very much. Every month I give a couple recommendations outside of what I read. This month, October specifically, I got really into this podcast called Once Upon a Time at Bennington College. Bennington College is a small liberal arts school in Vermont. It's sort of famous for having this amazing writing program, and tons of famous writers have come out of it. And at one time, Donna Tartt, Jonathan Lethem, and Bret Easton Ellis were all students together at Bennington College. And this podcast is the most gossipy, ridiculous podcast. So detailed. At this point, there's been 15 episodes. It would have been 4 probably, but it tells you what Donna Tartt was wearing, who she was sleeping with, what so-and-so said about who she was sleeping with, what so-and-so heard from so-and-so about who she was sleeping with. It is so gossipy in a really nerdy way, which I love. So I recommend you get into that, especially if you're a Donna Tartt fan or Jonathan Lethem fan. I'm assuming you're not a Bret Easton Ellis fan. In addition to that, if you get into that, there is an amazing New Yorker article came out this month that is the perfect companion piece. If you've read The Secret History, it takes place at Bennington. It's not called Bennington, but it's Bennington. It tells the story of Donna Tartt and her classmates with different names in this classics class with this very charismatic professor. That professor, everyone sort of understands, is based off a professor who worked at Bennington named Claude Fredericks. Claude Fredericks, famously a diarist. Great piece, November 1st, it was published in the New Yorker, all about his diaries. He is thought to be the most prolific diarist, published diarist of all time, just wrote down everything in a really beautiful, poetic way. Sarton, who I mentioned, Journal of a Solitude, she is referenced as another great diarist in this story. Anne Goldstein, who is our beloved Ferrante translator. She's mentioned in here. This is a really good piece, even if that podcast doesn't sound up your alley, which I promise you it's really fun. But if it's not for you, that's cool. You should still read this piece on Claude Fredericks. What a dude, you know? And that's it. That's my October and November. It's the last night of Hanukkah, and I'm gonna go make some latkes. Obviously, I am making Deb Perlman's recipe. We only do Smitten Kitchen for Jewish-related foods in this house. I made her challah last week. All right, that's it. That's all I have. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. Please let me know your favorite book you read this fall, if you've read any of the books that I talked about, and if you're mad at me about what I said about open water. All right, see you soon. Love you, nerds.